Everyone, welcome back to the Questioning Behaviour podcast. As always, it's me, Merle, and I'm here with my much better half, Sarah Bowen.
Hi guys, happy 2022.
And that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. We are going to talk, well, not about 2022. I guess, we can discuss our hopes and dreams for the next year. Hope it's better than 2021. But today we're going to talk about, just with the two of us, what's actually been going on in 2021 from the perspective of behavioral science, of course.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects.
So, Sarah, should we first just discuss the major elephant in the room? What has behavioral science done with regards to COVID and, of course, vaccination? Because obviously, you're the expert on that. I have become a complete ostrich. I'm just sticking my head in the sand, on top of the sand. And honestly, I just don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's a very relatable reaction to the pandemic, especially as we are sort of 3 years in, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So expert is a bit of a generous term, I would say, to do with vaccinations and behavioral science. But we have, I think, seen some interesting developments in the past year, which I'm excited to talk about, and especially developments in terms of evidence of things just not working, which is interesting to discuss. One of the biggest contributors, I think we can say, being Katie Milkman and her colleagues, with the work that she has been pioneering. Majority of the stuff she's done has been in the States, but some really interesting stuff about how behavioral science can help design interventions to overcome vaccine hesitancy and get us up to a good number of people who are vaccinated. In terms of sort of behavioral science, we've seen work regarding sort of the effectiveness of financial incentives, particularly lotteries, and the results of the use of lotteries have sort of been, I don't know, not so exciting, I guess. Or the cost of the lottery doesn't seem to match up with the benefit of putting on a lottery, vaccine lottery. So
fair enough.
There was that. That was a paper published this year, Milkman and her colleagues.
I mean, all credit to Katie Milkman. Obviously, she's publishing on she's researching a topic that is of great interest. But I mean, to look at this as a win-win situation, she's published a lot this year. Like academically, Katie's done great.
Oh yeah, fantastically, actually. And I think this is a really interesting result because people would expect that any sort of financial incentive or any chance to win a lot of money for being vaccinated is going to work. And in this
I mean, would you necessarily? I find that because, I mean, keep in mind, obviously, if you don't have a particularly strong opinion about vaccination, I can imagine that, do I want to put in the effort of driving God knows how far? Because vaccination points in America have been relatively scattered, especially in the more rural or less densely populated areas. And then, of course, it becomes a question of, do I want to put in this amount of effort to go somewhere to get vaccinated versus, is this financial compensation or incentive good enough to offset the amount of effort? But if you have a very, very strong opinion and you're very strongly anti-vax, I'm not entirely sure how much financial incentive would ever be enough to change your opinion. I'm just wondering if you were to actually separate people in their strength of opinion and create different demographic groups based on that, I have a feeling it would be incredibly difficult to trigger anyone with a strong opinion to change their mind. I think someone who's pro-vax would always get a vaccination, granted that the science behind it is actually seemingly legit, but someone who's anti-vax, I think, is very, very difficult to change, especially if they're like a fundamental anti-vaxxer. I wasn't super surprised when the lottery didn't work. I would have been happily surprised if it had. I'm not super surprised it didn't.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, you're sort of talking about the two groups of people were trying to get vaccinated as sort of in a sort of dichotomy. Although I do think you're right. There are people for whom, they are always going to get vaccinated. They don't need any incentive. They will pay any cost, that end of the distribution, and
Sure.
there are people who exist at the other end of the distribution. But I'm imagining that these are sort of tail ends of a distribution, and that
Sure.
an intervention like this, a behavioral intervention like this, is sort of trying to sway the people who are in the middle, I guess, whose
Yeah.
beliefs aren't, so
Super
strongly
solid.
set,
Yeah.
so strongly set, and they can be swayed. I mean, what was interesting about this financial intervention was that it was a geographically targeted lottery. So imagine in the UK we have things like postcode lotteries, for
Yeah.
example. So it was done in Philadelphia in the States. So if you were an adult, there was a commercial database with sort of details of all the adult population. If you were on this database, then you were automatically entered into this lottery. So the idea was that people, regardless of the vaccination status, were entered into the lottery. But if your name was picked, if your ticket was picked, you could only collect your winnings if you had been vaccinated. So
Right. I see.
the intervention itself, I think, and the authors argue, was trying to work on some regret aversion mechanism.
Okay.
Right?
I see. I see. That
Exactly.
looks
So
a bit different than I thought. Okay.
yeah. So it's not just sort of a transactional, you turn up, we give you £15, thank you for being vaccinated. It wasn't that sort of intervention. It was, and you knew that your neighbors had been entered as well. So there was a sort of a social norm aspect, I guess, of, if your name gets picked, it's sort of a public drawing of the lottery. People will know you've been picked. You can only collect your earnings if you have been vaccinated, if you could show proof of vaccination, I think of at least one vaccination, right? So they didn't rely on people entering the lottery themselves, right? Because you would have had massive selection. And it was an interestingly designed experiment, because sort of in the field, they had to come up with a creative way to create a control group. They manipulated the stakes of the lottery as well. They sort of experimentally manipulated it. So, for example, you could have won £1,000, you could have won £5,000, or up to £50,000. So the stakes were quite high, but obviously in a lottery, the chances of winning are not so great. So
Are slim.
yeah, that's what was manipulated in the experiment. They manipulated the chances that people would win based on sort of geographical postcode location. Essentially, the findings were they saw a slight uptick in vaccinations in the first treatment group, so to the treatment group with the sort of the highest chance of individuals winning, following the initial announcement of the sweepstakes of the lottery. But this wasn't sustained. So, and none of the other treatment sort of zip code areas saw an increase in vaccination status. So yeah, the bottom line was a really cool, interesting idea, could potentially work if we think regret aversion is strong enough, and as the sort of maybe social pressure to get vaccinated could also be sort of targeted through this intervention. But in the end, the cost of the sweepstakes outweighed the benefit.
Okay. No, I just find this result really interesting. Like if it shows that, it is the group with the highest chance of winning, God knows how much money, but a significant amount, especially for most Americans, because I think America is not a social welfare state, country, whatever you want to call it. So I think a lot of people there, a lot of individuals, especially entrepreneurs, have been hit like just incredibly hard. But I do think that as a result of that, I think an additional 1,000, 5,000, 50,000 US dollars would make a large difference to a lot of people. But if you see that the only real change occurs in the group where there is the highest chance of winning, isn't that an indication that these people really desperately want a certainty of money? And as a result of that, wouldn't you be able to incentivize them with, if you go get vaccinated, we will pay you? Not as in a chance of winning, but as, give someone, I mean, obviously you can't give everyone who was on the fence before like $50,000. You probably can't even give them 1,000, because that's, first of all, not really fair to the people who have already been vaccinated. I also don't think it's financially viable, but it does signal that maybe you have to find for which subset of people what amount of money is doable or enough to incentivize going getting vaccinated. And you have to
Yeah.
wonder whether it actually matters in the end, why they get vaccinated. Like we've had this really interesting talk with Melina Palmer, where does it matter why people do a desired behavior as long as they do the behavior? Especially if it's something that doesn't have to be sustained over time, that just has to happen this once. Although, quite frankly, I do think we'll be on like an annual COVID vaccination soon. I don't think this is like one vaccination and you're moving on,
No,
especially since
exactly.
boosters have now been introduced.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean it's an interesting point. I think what I would say is that this result or this sort of partial result is proof
Mm,
of the fact that stakes do matter. Like if you just
sure,
increase the lottery to an sort of an exponential amount, I'm sure you could move the needle a little bit. The problem
sure,
is the cost of putting on the lottery is too large, essentially,
sure.
for the benefit of the uptick. So we know that stakes matter. And I think, you raise an interesting question of, why don't we just pay people for getting vaccinated? And I think the answer to that is that it's complicated.
Mm,
I would need to go on a bit of a deep dive to see whether or not there have been studies looking at sort of compensating people financially or sort of rewarding people
mm-hmm,
financially for vaccinating themselves, for
mm-hmm,
example. But I do know there's a large literature in sort of behavioral economics about how introducing financial incentives changes sort of the social norms, and
true.
has sort of
No, very, very
unintended
true.
consequences in that sense. And so I'm not sure how it would affect that. I mean, the argument that there are people who are financially vulnerable and so are going to be very, very much influenced by the opportunity to earn some money by getting vaccinated is a bit ethically dubious, in my opinion. There have been sort of conversations about paying people to donate blood
Mm-hmm,
for the same sort of ethical bioethics conversations come up. Should you
mm-hmm.
pay people to donate organs, all of this sort of stuff? Should you pay people to get vaccinated? Maybe it's not quite a one-to-one, but I still think there are some interesting ethical concerns there. And
I mean, I'll be honest,
I'm
I'm pro all of the things you just mentioned. So maybe I'm just very, very
okay.
biased.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd have to do a bit of a deep dive into the actual consequences of
No,
this.
absolutely.
About who then selects them into these activities, and are there unintended
Sure.
consequences for that? I mean, I know for blood donation, there's there are consequences potentially for the quality of the blood that's donated. We could go, that's a
Mm-hmm,
different tangent. The other important thing I think is that exactly what we said at the beginning about there are people who are extremely hesitant to get the vaccine,
mm-hmm,
and that hesitancy is based more largely, I guess, in how they have created their beliefs, right? And introducing financial incentives, I'm not sure if there's much evidence that that can get people to sort of overcome their hesitancy. I'm not sure if that's the correct way or the most effective.
No, absolutely. But I think, I mean, I obviously mainly know the situation in my own country, which is the Netherlands. I presume you know the one for the UK quite well. I think, because America just forces itself to be the center of the world, that most people will have an idea of what's going on in the States. When I look at how the Dutch government specifically handled, oh my God, we have a vaccine, get vaccinated, and, we can end the lockdowns. That is how that was sold to us. That did not happen. We are currently in our fifth lockdown. So if you were ever a bit like on the fence of like, oh, am I gonna get vaccinated? And you weren't like particularly anti and you're relatively pro science, But the main thing that you are is pro freedom, which the Dutch really are. The Dutch, though, are very individualistic. You don't restrict the Dutch in their freedom of movement. They don't react particularly well to it. So a lot of people got vaccinated not because they gave a damn about saving someone else's grandma, which I think is a very nice and decent motivation to get vaccinated, but they were just like, if I get vaccinated, I can move about. But
Mm.
after the third lockdown and then the fourth lockdown and the fifth lockdown, that wasn't a very convincing reason to still get vaccinated. So as a result of this, I also think a lot less people are going to get the booster which has become available since I think November in the Netherlands, and I think my age group or anyone above 18 can get it from January onwards. I think booster uptake won't be that high because for us, what has happened, and this is a complete fuck up on the Dutch government's behalf, is that we have associated vaccinations with freedom. But if you've had lockdown after lockdown after lockdown, you have been given no freedom. Your freedom has been repeatedly taken away. So the vaccine or the vaccination is clearly not as effective as people have made it out to be. And this was a very, very dangerous marketing strategy, if you will, for announcing what the vaccination could do. So, and there have been other governments who've done this completely differently. The Australian government has had many more severe and longer lockdowns than the Netherlands. The UK government has followed a similar pattern to the Netherlands, and the States is just all over the place, if you kind of ask me. I think it's very dangerous in the way these governments have done it. And the Dutch government did not have a behavioral scientist or any type of psychologist or anyone who really understands people in their decision making unit about what to tell people about the vaccinations, how to roll them out, how to market them, how information should be distributed. Because at the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of fear mongering, there was a lot of false promises, and then these vaccinations were hailed as the solution and as a promise for no longer having lockdowns. Starting out with fear as a message is a very, very effective political strategy, which is very often associated with dictatorships. I'm just leaving that little nugget out there. But if a democratic government is leading with fear mongering, and there are enough people who start to realize that this is kind of bullshit, but still, if that is your anchoring point, and then there is enough information coming out, because most democratic states do not control their media or information flow, and suddenly there's hundreds of contrasting and contradicting ideas, and people don't actually know what's true, and people lose faith in their government because the Dutch government, especially the two people in charge of doing all these press conferences, like, this is what's going to happen now, and this is how many people have died today. Like, obviously that information is terrible, but a lot of people have lost complete faith in these people representing the government and in these people actually representing any type of decent management of getting us out of this pandemic. And I think the way that governments or any type of information has been marketed or spread or set up is something that they should have asked a couple of behavioral scientists, or for my case, for all I care, just a single sociologist with a good track record of public information. They should have asked someone what they should have done, because this has become an absolute shit show. I'm not saying that if they had hired a behavioral scientist, this person would have been able to figure it out by themselves, but I do think it would have been better than what we have now. Because, like you said, there's a lot of misinformation spreading, and it's just not helping.
Yeah. I mean, misinformation is spreading regardless of what the government or what the official bodies are putting out, right? That's
sure,
like
but they're not helping right now.
I mean, you covered so much. So first of all, this idea that the narrative around vaccines was, quite strongly, take the vaccine, we won't have to go back into lockdowns. We can keep moving forward. We can recover. People won't get sick if we were all vaccinated. So, I mean, what's the context around that in the Netherlands? Do you know, is there quite high vaccine take up? And yet you still went into lockdown, or was there not enough vaccine take up, which is why you had to keep going back into lockdown?
I think the vaccination take up in the Netherlands has been about 85%, that it's only amongst adults, because I think quite a few governments have done this, at least I hope so, because otherwise we really look like a bunch of clowns. But the Dutch government has always had this weak spot for young children, where vaccination is not mandatory with children. And children are very often exempt from lockdowns. Children are exempt from wearing face covers, or masks, if you will, which I think is ridiculous, because no offense to anyone who is or has children, but children are dirty. I'm very sorry to in the way that
Maybe
children don't think about personal hygiene to the same extent that an adult does. Obviously, children come into touch with lots of other children. Their personal hygiene isn't fully developed, if that's the way you want to put it. They are actually massive, massive spreaders of bacteria and viruses. And then they are exempt from everything. I thought it was very, very strange. I thought it was a dumb decision from the get-go, and I don't think that's helping the Netherlands now. And I understand, like, I have read a lot of work actually. I think Paul Dolan has been very, very vocal in this specific subset of work, where it is very damaging to young children to be locked up at home, not be able to go to school, and miss out on, well, I suppose several of Piaget's developmental stages that are enforced by school, by interacting with people your age, by interacting with different forms of authority, such as your teachers, your parents, your babysitter. And to learn from a very young age how to function in society, I can imagine that this will have, you know, some serious consequences. I'm just not entirely sure that that is worse than having children wear face covers and getting them vaccinated and making vaccination rates, unless there's a very good medical excuse for not to mandatory.
I mean,
That is my opinion. That is not scientific. That is my opinion.
yeah, I mean, I know in the UK we have followed sort of a similar track. For example, it's not mandatory for children to wear face coverings. I mean, I'm not sure how much of that is just, you know, have you ever tried to get a child to wear a face covering and keep it on? Like, impossible.
Is it?
Maybe that's not a good enough excuse, or maybe that's not even the real reason why it's not been made mandatory for kids to wear face coverings. So I know that the strategy in the UK for rolling out the vaccines, for who was going to be prioritized first, they did it based on vulnerability. So
Yeah.
age, you know, the eldest get vaccinated first, and also the
Which,
people
in
who are
all
vulnerable.
fairness, I also have some serious questions about.
Interesting. I'm interested to hear your questions. But they, you know, and also people who were going to be most at risk of contracting and passing on the virus. And there was a lot of discussion around which professions should be included in that.
Yeah, we had a similar debate. We had a similar debate. It was
Exactly.
so weird because there was obviously everyone in healthcare had to go first.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, these people are on the front lines, nothing but respect for them. And shame on every government who has promised pay rises and better working conditions and has not delivered. You suck, which is also a jab at the Dutch government. You should be fucking embarrassed. That's all I have to say. But it's obviously that these people would have to be vaccinated first. But I think in the Netherlands there was an issue halfway through where apparently in this priority list GPs were not included, and I'm like, what the fuck? How did you forget GPs? The people that if you're not deadly ill with COVID-like symptoms, that's where you go. What were they? I don't know. I think a lot of people just, when push came to shove, did not actually think most
Yeah.
things
I mean,
through. It was embarrassing.
there have been holes in strategies across governments, across, you know, all over the world, that we can look at retrospectively and say, how did we come to this decision? Seems
Yeah,
odd.
I mean, and another thing is obviously, and I think this is just a very good description of the political state of the Netherlands, where the current party that we have in charge is definitely a party which is like, yeah, we can run the country like a business. I'm like, yeah, into the ground you can. But there was also another thing. Obviously, people in healthcare should be vaccinated. Teachers, preferably also really quite early on, especially because they wanted to get younger kids back into schools. How about you also think about cleaners and garbage collectors? They forgot that group as well, whereas they never really stopped working, because that is a profession where if they stop working, you are screwed. And it's just why do people find that so difficult to think about? Why is it so difficult? Yeah, anyway, I feel like I'm just getting angry, and this has nothing to do with behavioral science
No,
anymore.
well, I think what all of this shows is that we were never ready for a pandemic,
No, we were not.
and we still kind of aren't. We're still kind of making it up as we go along. I mean, that's not a fresh hot take. We've been saying that from the start.
It's
But
true.
you know, and it's easy to look back and, you know, with hindsight bias, and sort of say, how did we come to this conclusion? How did we miss this large group of people who were at risk? And yeah, we can talk about that all day.
We've referenced the work by both Paul Dolan and Katie Milkman. I think there's a lot more to come from both of them, and from obviously also their colleagues. It's not like they're working by their lonesome. They have amazing teams behind them, well, next to them actually, and we'll keep our eyes peeled for what's going on there. I do think from a behavioral science perspective, there's just been a lot of challenges that the world wasn't ready for, and neither was behavioral science. We're learning the limits of our remit, the limits of some of our assumptions, and the limits of what we can and can't do with regards to presenting information, presenting incentives, changing incentives. And it's just it's just not going the way we had hoped, I think, is the nicest way of saying this.
I mean, I don't know. I think there was some positive results that came out this year in terms of
Nothing
behavioral
scarier
science.
than a positive result this year.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Mince your words, Sarah. Mince your words.
Some optimistic results about
Very nice.
insights. So, for example, I just wanted to mention Katie Milkman and her colleagues also published a study which looked at text-based nudges and about the type of information included in sort of a text message reminder that could be sent out to people just before they went to their doctor's appointment to try and increase the numbers of people who were actually being vaccinated at those appointments. And there were some interesting results. They actually tested 19 different versions of an experimental sort of condition. And it was interesting that they were able to find that the timing of the text message really mattered. So sending it just before your doctor's appointment, as opposed to sort of a week or two before, made the intervention more effective. And also the top performing interventions, which, and when I say top performing, I'm talking about the increased vaccination rates by sort of 11% compared to a sort of business as usual baseline, were those messages that were framed as a reminder. So, remember next, when you go to a doctor's appointment, you can ask for the vaccine. And also those messages that were congruent with a sort of a communication style that people would expect between a patient and a healthcare provider, right? So making sure the tone and the language used in the text message was, what people would expect with sort of a health-based communication or health. So really
I can just imagine getting like a text message from IGB being like, "Hey, player, don't forget your vaccination, bro." I'm like, okay. Would have been hilarious. Would have loved that.
Definitely not getting my vaccination if my doctor's talking to me like that. That's sending off some warning signs in my brain.
It's signaling that I think my doctor has been hacked, which the Dutch healthcare, which is referred to as the GGD, has been hacked multiple times during the pandemic because, we care about cybersecurity.
Yeah. So just not to spend too much time on the null result or the sort of less interesting for actual future applications of behavioral science results. There have been some really nice takeaways that we can really implement.
Yes, and a null result is still a result because you are questioning the assumptions that everything is based on.
Exactly.
That is something we should leave in 2021. The idea that a null result is not a result. A null result is a fucking dope result. Fight me.
Yeah, no, I feel like most people would be on board with that. The problem is it doesn't make
get published
article to read, especially when you have to sort of position it as like a huge contribution to the field.
I mean, I think none of this is working is a pretty dope contribution, if you ask me.
Yeah.
But hey, it's not the moral support we need after the years we've just had.
No, definitely not. And it hasn't just been in terms of developing interventions or insights that could potentially help us develop future interventions to increase vaccine updates. Behavioral science has contributed to developing models and frameworks for understanding behaviors around vaccine uptake. So, for example, the 3C model, which was developed by the SAGE working group in cooperation or collaboration with the behavioralist, that consultancy group. The 3Cs they map out for vaccine uptake are confidence, complacency, and convenience. So,
okay,
it's very combi type model. Opportunity, motivation. What's the other one?
Opportunity, motivation, and capability. I do love how you did them in the wrong order.
I did. My brain doesn't quite map out.
No, you work with the OMC model. OMC.
And that's it. Exactly. That's its very famous cousin.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so there have been some cool developments, some cool interactions and collaborations between government organizations, local government organizations, and behavioral consultancy groups. So lots of really cool work has been done in 2020 and 2021. May it continue. We can't mention it all here because otherwise you'd be listening.
No. If we step away from the behavioral science specifically of vaccinations and move, I mean, it's an adjacent topic, move into the behavioral science of, working from home and like the mental health aspects that, behavioral science has done quite a lot of work there as well. We have, within this podcast specifically, have talked to Ali Fenwick, who has researched working from home and different types of panic working. I think that's going to be a very interesting body of literature. The reason for that is actually really simple. Obviously, we've been working at, from home or from, not the office. Some people go out to Starbucks if they're allowed to and work there. And it's just really interesting how different that is. And there's always been a massive push towards remote working, or at least working more flexibly. But there are some serious drawbacks to that as well. So I'm curious to see how that field develops further, and what solutions it may or may not pose. Because I know, especially from our generation and maybe a bit older, I think anyone under 35, their idea of working is not the same as those who have been working for much longer, say 35, 45 plus. Because I'm pretty sure it's the 30 somethings that came up with, being a digital nomad, just traveling the world, working from a laptop, and then being, going from hostel to hostel, or God knows whatever. I mean, I can't say it appeals to me, quite frankly, but that is a serious movement. And of course, it fits in with remote working quite nicely. Granted that you can travel from hostel to hostel, restrictions permitting. I just find it really interesting. I mean, I'm curious to see what more comes out, because so far, a lot of the benefits that were initially associated with working from home, due to the restrictions of the lockdown, have turned into monsters of their own.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you to clarify what you meant by sort of a different approach to work between sort of different generations.
I think if you look at the older generations, the idea that you'd have to come in at work somewhere between 8 and 9, and you'd leave somewhere between 5 to 6. Again, this is on average. I'm sure there's many people who are currently 50 years old who have worked 12-hour work days. I'm not saying that's never happened, but it's just, when you work, and when you're at home, you don't work. And the idea that you go into the office is much more prominent. Office is work. Or if you work in a factory, obviously you know how I mean it. The location where you work is where you work, and otherwise not so much. Just the idea also that you could be with a company for, say, longer than 10 years. I think that is an idea that doesn't really stick with current generations anymore. And I don't know. I just feel like there also the fact that maybe through work you could build up a pension. I don't think that's something a lot of people of our generation are still counting on. It's just this idea what work is, what work should be. I think a conversation we had with John is also that, and this has intertwined very insidiously, but we, or people of younger generations, may still make the mistake that work is where your passion should lie, and that work shouldn't just be the thing to pay the bills. It should also be where you derive a significant chunk of your identity and your self-worth, that your passion is within your work, and predominantly within your work. And I somehow feel like older generations maybe had a slightly healthier view of work in that way.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe.
healthy is an interesting word. I mean, I do think what it comes down to is flexibility around work, where you work, when you work, who you work for, I guess. Something we've been forced to experience more flexible type working because we've moved.
Sure.
A lot of people have moved from into a home working environment, and I think that comes with lots of behavioral challenges, which we've been, we're very lucky we've been able to talk with experts who have studied the sort of psychology around work and around the difference between sort of home working and working in a workplace type working. And we've been lucky to be able to share those conversations with you, sort of as you said, with Ali, and also Carolyn as well, who we interviewed for this season. She had some really cool, interesting things to say about this topic.
Yes, but that episode is still coming up, dear listener, so look forward to that.
Yes, you can look forward to that. But yeah, it's been a really interesting place for behavioral science to contribute 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure what the consequences of increased working from home will be in the long run, whether or not we will all adjust. I mean, I feel like it doesn't take too long for humans to adjust to a new normal, and
True.
but we'll see. I mean, it's a developing field. I think as technology develops, the idea of more flexible working will develop with it. I mean, as you said, there's this sort of model of a more nomad type millennial worker eating and living and sleeping and working in a van and traveling around the world.
Oh god, what a nightmare.
I'm not sure what percentage of the workforce that makes up. They maybe are just we're just overexposed to the vloggers and the bloggers on YouTube who
Probably
live a lifestyle. But I think it's only natural with the developments in technology that we'll move towards a more flexible working style, and that has positives and negatives that come with it. And
sure. I'm true. Positives and negatives for sure.
More positives than negatives, I would argue.
I wonder about that. I genuinely wonder about that. I mean, the reason why I'm kind of wondering about it, because the association with flexibility is that starting at the lowest tier, if it's not convenient for you, if you're not a morning person, then don't work in the morning. Sure, fair enough. I personally am not a morning person. I think if I can roll out of bed when it's convenient for me, work out, and then get to I want to say an 8-hour day, but a day in which I get done what needs to get done on that day. I think to me, being goal oriented rather than time oriented is preferable. If you can be in your level of employment, which is another form of flexibility, which I'm very much pro, then that is a good thing. But as you know, Ali has written multiple articles about this. We will make sure to link them down below. A lot of people see this flexibility as a reason, also driven by different forms of stress, anxiety, and fear, especially in a very insecure job market, that they have to be on 24/7, and rather than just working to get your 8 hours, to get your 10 hours, to meet your goals, whatever, they are just constantly working to prove to their managers, who can't currently see them because they're not sitting next to you in your living room, because that would be incredibly creepy. That you have different ways now of proving to them that you are in fact a good employee. I'm interested in seeing how that is going to develop. How do you, if you're never, or if you're not as often in touch with your managers or the people who actually appraise you, how do you prove that you're actually any good? And I think that will be a psychological struggle that we still have to figure out. And I also think this will separate the decent managers from the good managers. I think there's a lot there that has to change as well.
Yeah, I think definitely people have to be better, more skilled at setting healthy boundaries themselves.
Yeah. Or have them enforced by their managers.
Well, this is the thing, like, whose responsibility is it really for workers to be setting healthy boundaries? If we are taking on a model where it is the workers and the individual themselves, it's up to them how they manage their stress. They need to be the one to say, okay, I'm not going to look at my laptop past 6 o'clock, or I'm going to have to put into place things like taking email off of my mobile phone, and it's all based on the individual worker to set the healthy boundary. I do think there is a role for the organizations to play in setting a company culture, and also setting up technology in a way that helps support people to maintain, healthy work-life balances and work-life boundaries.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think there's a lot of monitoring that needs to be done there, and not monitoring in the way where it's like, oh, you told me you were going to have this project finished 12 minutes ago, but you still haven't sent me the finish. Like, not that type of micromanagement. That's ridiculous. But I do think that if a manager sees that some of his or her, let's just say their employees, or maybe one employee specifically, is constantly sending around emails with project updates or finished projects, whatever, at 4 a.m., you might be a decent person by going like, hey, I noticed that you keep emailing me at like 4 a.m. what's going on there. It might just be that this person is a night owl and they start work at 12, like at midnight, and then they finish around 8 in the morning, and then, whatever. If the company allows for that type of flexible working and the employee is genuinely happy with this roster, I guess let it slide. But if this person starts work at 8 a.m., then has a full working day till about 5 or 6 p.m., then maybe has children, of course, difficult to say. Then after having worked with the children, which is often known as a second shift, especially for women, and then goes back to work and then still works, still sends emails at 4 a.m., that's not right. And I do think that is up to managers to figure out what is going on there. Because especially if someone has not just themselves to take care of, but also, has an actual family, and this is especially disproportionately true for women, they work more. They do their regular job, then the second shift, which is the family caretaking, and then they often get back to work because they initially didn't finish their 9 to 5. Because children don't just show up at 5 p.m. and be like, Mom, it would be nice if you took care of me now. It just doesn't work.
I mean, I think even from, you're describing multiple different hypothetical situations of observe something like an email at 4 a.m. There could be a multitude of individual and heterogeneous reasons why someone is working.
Yes, but you do need to know.
I mean, this is the problem of being able to effectively diagnose the cause or the root or the reasons behind why we observe a specific thing, like an email at 4 a.m. And behavioral science can help us, but also effective management systems can help us, and communication, all of which can be influenced by behavioral science for sure. But it's a huge problem, and it's hard to diagnose, it's hard to directly observe. But ultimately, I think where we're going to get the best result is where we align the interests of the company and the workers together. About sort of saying
absolutely
that finding the evidence and doing the research and showing that when workers have better work-life balances and have better boundaries in place, they are more productive, they produce more, they produce higher quality work. And if we can show that, and if there is evidence to that effect, then we align the interests of the companies and the individual workers and produce better systems, essentially. But maybe that evidence doesn't exist. Maybe it's more profitable for workers to maybe it's more profitable for companies to burn their workforce into the ground and rehire them every 5 years. And I'm sure that is actually a profitable system in many organizations.
Anyway, despite this, to make a slightly more positive segue, despite the fact that, risk of burnout, panic working, and very negative aspects of working from home were very plausible, what I have noticed, and I find it really quite ironic, is that a lot of very influential people this year came out with books. As in, so clearly, maybe they finally had more time for their side projects. I suppose if you can't really leave the house, writing a book is a really good option for you. I don't know. What do you think? Were you keen on some of the books coming out?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, cards on table, I'm not a big reader. I'm much more, I'm a podcaster, visual, video, online based type of information vacuum. So I'm not as big a reader or a writer as I know that you are. But there were some great books released this year, and also some great book lists compiled by some of our favorite behavioral science contributors. So Habit Wheatley, for example, or behavioralscientist.org produce fantastic lists of the books that were released in the last year. I haven't read any of them.
For full transparency, have I read any of them? I'm currently reading Zoe Chance's Influence, which will be released soon. Technically speaking, did not get published in 2021, so don't doubt me. But no, there's been a couple of great books announced. There've been a couple of really interesting books released. Obviously, I think if you're slightly more new to behavioral science, you will have noticed the updated and potentially final version of Nudge, you will have noticed Kahneman in collaboration with Sunstein and Subini coming out with the book Noise. I've read reviews of the book Noise. They weren't particularly good. These are not my own opinion. It's other people's opinion. The updated version of Nudge, I have to admit, I understand the motivation for why they updated it. We've talked to Cass Sunstein ourselves. It made a lot of sense that some of the case studies that they were using were of a context no longer relevant, maybe no longer politically correct, which I think that's as good a reason as any other to update the stuff. But yeah, I mean, Vanessa Bones has also written a book on influence. I am very interested in reading that one. Logan Ury has written a book about applying behavioral science to dating, which I personally love poking my nose in everyone else's dating life. So I think that is a book I would 100% recommend. And yeah, there's and I thought this was so random. Sutherland Rory released a book on transport, and I was just like, what? When that came out, I was a bit like, why? I haven't read it yet. It's on the list because Rory is a very good writer. He's a very entertaining writer. So I'm looking forward to that one. Haven't read it yet, but it's on the list. And then another book that caught me a bit off guard, again, hasn't been published in 2021, is coming forth in 2022, is Sam Tatum's book. Again, you know, Sam Tatum obviously has done some great work, is connected to Rory Sutherland, but yeah, I'm looking forward to his book as well. It's just that I should have done more reading in the past Christmas holiday, but I didn't.
Oh man, yeah, so many great books. I'm so sorry to all of the wonderful authors. I'm just not a big reader.
A reader.
I'm really. But
if it makes you feel any better, the only reading I've done during the Christmas break isn't like on books on investing.
Oh wow! Well,
yeah, I know, right?
From investing advice, then you can do the research.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm perfectly happy to summarize the book for you, but I give no financial advice. I am not a financial advisor.
That's good. Our lawyers need us to say this, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm sorry, behavioral science. I've been cheating on you with finance. It is what it is.
Hey, behavioral science is everywhere, even in finance. We already know this.
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. So the latest book I read, if someone is like remotely interested in like finance, was actually Ken Fisher's book on like debunking. So it's a book on debunking like 50 myths from mainly investing. I definitely think there's some behavioral science there as well about how people reason about certain things, why you should doubt common sense and all this type of stuff. It's really, really good. If you don't like finance, I mean, I'm not going to say it's like the most entertaining book ever. Sometimes it's a bit dry, but it is finance after all. And they used like quite a lot of historical examples, but I thought it was a great book. I would recommend it.
Do you know, I've realized we've missed one of the biggest developments in behavioral science this year.
Oh God, what is it?
You passed your Viva.
Oh my God, that's so not relevant.
You're officially a doctor. So listener,
yes.
If you didn't see it on Twitter or you don't follow us or anything like that, Merle Vandenacker is now a doctor and passed her PhD and is on to bigger and brighter things.
True.
Yeah. Huge congratulations.
Thanks.
One of us in
you're such a rando. You're such a rando. No, I passed the PhD and the Viva. I'm now allowed to call myself doctor, which if you do follow me on social media, you have realized that I have put my title everywhere. And actually, on the topic of writing books, then I've actually written a book. It's not published. I hope to get this published in 2022. But I actually have to figure out how to publish this because it's not a book like Zoe Chance's Influence, for example, which is, I mean, I've started reading it already, which is very pop sciencey, but like, you know, really interesting. It's for a mainstream audience. I've written a book about the PhD experience and how to optimize it from like start to finish. That is very much not a pop science book, but I hope to get this thing out in 2022, and I hope it can help people to figure out the PhD a bit better, whether that's in behavioral science or not. Which, ironically, I'm getting very good at these segues, by the way, I have to say, is why we started the early career part of our podcast series, which we also did in 2021, which, I mean, they've become very popular episodes, and we've gotten good feedback on them as well. And I just genuinely hope that we have been able to give a bit more insight through interviewing people with very different experiences from our own about what's going on in a PhD, whether that's in behavioral science, behavioral economics, more experimental economics. Yeah.
Pretty good. I mean, give us a quick preview. What what are one of the tips that you give in the book? Can you give this away for free about optimizing the PhD experience? Like, is that
Yes.
something you can share with us? A little nugget?
I'm perfectly happy to do so. So the book has literally 6 entire sections, and I don't mean chapters, I mean sections, where the first one is genuinely about the idea of doing a PhD and what you really have to look out for, and whether you can check if you're even compatible with doing a PhD, or whether your goal can be achieved through not doing a PhD. Because I think a lot of people think that they need a PhD to do good research. And that is just an assumption that I don't really vibe with, especially not given how many amazing people we know in behavioral science who do great research and who are leaders in research, but they just don't happen to be academics. So they don't have PhDs, they've never done PhDs. But like, I don't think Rory Sutherland has been disadvantaged by not having a PhD. It's fucking Rory Sutherland. He's fine.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking about people who are individuals. Maybe they are not the
No,
rule.
sure, but
Rory Sutherland, I don't think I've ever met anyone like Rory Sutherland, so
I don't think there is anyone like Rory Sutherland if we see him for the personality that he is. But it's very difficult to deny, if you ask me, that there are people who are very successful in behavioral science who don't hold PhDs. And of
100%.
course it does help if you have the right motivation for opting into doing a PhD, because the wrong motivation can be a killer throughout the whole process of the actual PhD. I think it's an incredible waste of time, effort, and potentially even self-esteem to go into a PhD with the wrong motivation and have to quit halfway through, because quitting a PhD is an incredibly painful process. So from there on, so it literally goes from the very idea of doing a PhD to how do you actually go about applying to one. I think that's a very intransparent process that a lot of people would also like some help with. So I've outlined all of that with some serious focus on selecting your supervisors.
Yeah.
Yeah, would definitely have a lot to say about that. And just from there on, what does the start of your PhD look like? What can you expect? How do you manage structure in your own mental health and your own research? Moving on to like the main body of the PhD, and then obviously the massive amount of potential mental health issues or just research issues or things that is not very often talked about in academia itself, but it is very, very important to know for your own personal and professional growth. And then how do you successfully finish a PhD? What does it mean to finish a PhD successfully? And then after you have submit the fucker, what then? Because I don't think there's a lot of aftercare in the PhD program either. So it's literally 6 sections on before you even start to way after you finish. Of course, with a lot of focus on, hey, just because you've done a PhD doesn't mean you have to stay in academia, and how would you go about that? And throughout your PhD, maybe even from the very start, figuring out, do you want to be an academic or not? And if you don't want to be an academic, what does that trajectory look like? If you want to go into government, if you want to go into corporate, how do you have to change, and how do you have to design your PhD in a way that actually works out? Yeah,
Awesome.
I've given this some serious thought.
So I asked for a nugget and I ended up with a
Sorry.
whole gold mine
Yeah,
of
you've
content.
literally ended up with the entire skeleton of the book.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm interested. You've sold it to me.
I'm so
It may
glad.
be one of the very few books that I read in my life. Who knows?
No, by the time that book, I mean, first of all, thank you. But second, by the time that book is out, you will have finished your PhD as well.
So, I mean, I think that is a fantastic note to end it on. We've done a retrospective. We've had a glimpse into the near future, some exciting developments to come. Is there anything else you wanted to mention?
I think just in general, I mean, this is a wrap up of the year 2021, with some slight nuggets of what to expect in 2022. From the podcast perspective, we still have amazing interviews coming up. So we've mentioned this one throughout, but I just realized we still have to publish the episode. We are going to talk to John Yakimovic about passion and whether passion should be in your work or not. We've got interviews coming up with David Fanner, with Phil Batista, and then more early career episodes as well with, for example, Jan Schimol, who I really, really enjoy talking to, especially because her PhD was done essentially in experimental economics, but she worked together with quite a few PhD students in the natural sciences, and that made for a very, very interesting contrast, which I think is nice to keep in mind how different fields, different sectors, for example, the humanities as compared to the behavioral sciences and the natural sciences, go about doing a PhD. I think that perspective really puts an interesting twist on what gets done in economics and also behavioral economics. And of course, we've got interviews coming up with both Carol and Zoe talking about cyber psychology and of course the science of influence. So really cool stuff is coming up. So I'm super excited about finishing this season strong somewhere in February, March. And we'll take it from there. Yeah, schedule permitting. Good things to come in 2022, even if we're just looking at the podcast. And I think with regards to events, if Nudge Talk, which we are both massive fans of, if they can pull off another great one like they did this year with, of course, our woman crush, Tara Austin, who knows so much about alternative medicine, I'd like to say, because she knows a lot about hallucinogenics. She wants to run for an MP in this topic as well. If we can get another awesome impromptu presentation like the one she pulled off, I think Nudge Talk 2022 will also be epic. But it has to be said actually about a lot of events that they've done online this year rather than physical. I think a lot of people did an absolutely great job. So I'm sure there will be many more events, whether they are held face-to-face or whether they are held online, which will make 2022 a great year for behavioral science, as a lot of companies and organizations also did for 2021. So I think that deserves a special shout out, because putting up an event online has a lot of challenges as well. And I think a lot of people could have just canceled and given up, but they pulled through, and they honestly, they organized some really dope events. So yeah. Shout out to them. 100%. Absolutely.
100%. And I think I just want to say on behalf of the both of us, thank you so much for everyone we've ever interviewed for this podcast series. Honestly, we could just make a whole podcast with us talking to each other, but it would never be as interesting as the episodes that we have put out, where we've got to interview some just fantastically generous people, generous with their time, generous with their contribution to behavioral science. So thank you so much. We're very, very small fish in a very, very big pond, and we know this, but still, we appreciate it. And thank you so much, you person listening to this right now. Break the fourth wall, for sticking with us to the end of this episode through arguments and disagreements and opinions and summaries. And just to say thanks for listening. Thank you for being a part of the behavioral science community, and we look forward to all the good things, we hope the good things that will be coming in 2022.
Absolutely. Guys, have a good 2022. We hope you had a great 2021 despite all the not so great things that happened. And as always, we hope you have a great week.
All your projects always be denying. You're the one alone.